Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, the series where I explore human decision-making as a risk and what we can do to mitigate it. Before we get into this episode, I'm delighted to be able to announce that this is the 100th episode in the series. So thank you to all of my guests and to the ever-increasing number of you that are subscribing to the series. If you like the show and want to help celebrate it reaching 3 figures, then I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a 5-star review on whichever platform you're using. It really does help. Right, with that celebration out of the way, on with the show. This is the second part of a discussion with Gerald Ashley and Rory Sutherland. If you haven't yet listened to the 99th episode, I recommend you start there, as this is part 2 of that conversation. Quick word of warning, this episode does contain some adult language, so if you're listening to this in front of kids or with anyone with sensitive ears, you might want to use some headphones. We left our 2 behavioural science gurus in the middle of a discussion which began on the subject of networks, and as conversations with Gerald and Rory typically do, meandered into fascinating topics that included the London Underground or tube map, and why network effects explain how technologies that logically shouldn't still be in use are, and why some really good ideas fail to take off. At the end of that episode, Gerald put forward the idea that resilience, being able to withstand shocks, is not often prioritised by organisations as they focus on efficiency. Resilience, he suggested, is expensive. Rory responded by saying that it might not be, and referred to the concept of prosilience. The idea of being proactive rather than reactive. In other words, rather than preparing to respond to things once they happen, work on the basis that they are going to happen, there are going to be challenges, and prepare to be able to embrace them. It's a subject that might seem at odds with the idea of human risk. After all, many of the things we need to be resilient against are the result of poor human decision-making. But actually, it's highly relevant, because when we look to manage human risk, we're also having an impact on what I call human reward, getting the most out of people, not in an exploitative way, but in terms of maximising their potential. The ways that we seek to promote human reward, for example in the incentives we offer people, have a direct impact on their human risk profile. If, for example, you effectively incentivise someone to make lots of sales without thinking about the human risk dynamics you might also be unleashing, then don't be surprised if they make those sales in ways that aren't in your organisation's best interests, inducing what in financial services is known as conduct risk. Equally, if you just think about mitigating human risk, then you potentially constrain human reward. An organisation with excessively bureaucratic processes won't necessarily get the most out of employees. You're not going to be at your best if you feel like your employer doesn't trust you and treats you like a small child. What Gerald and Rory explore in this episode is precisely this balance. How do we minimise human risk while maximising human reward? We pick up their conversation on that topic of prosilience. And as Rory is about to explain, one of the ways you make an organisation more prosilient is to think of the people within your organisation as not just a source for human risk, but also as sources of human reward. As with the last episode, the sheer number of stories, books and references Rory and Gerald make means I've included extended show notes, so you can explore things of particular interest to you afterwards. With that said, let's get back to Gerald and Rory and the subject of prosilience.
I think the idea of prosilience, which is there are 2 reasons to do this, it minimises the chance. So if you look at the random bees that don't follow the waggle dance, there are 2 reasons for those random bees, one of which is resilience, which is it prevents the hive becoming over-optimised around one mental model of the world. If every bee obeyed the waggle dance, you get trapped in a local maximum. Okay, so there's a resilience reason for the random bees, even though they're, to an accountant, to a bee accountant, a bee in a green eye shade, the bee accountant would only be interested in energy collected minus energy expended in the collection, which is the short-term accountant's mindset. But the random bees, which would look to the accountant as a short-term cost, pay off in 2 ways. Sometimes they actually save the hive's life by providing them with a plan B in the event that a cow wanders into the field and eats up all the pre-existing flowers about which they already know. The other thing the random bees do is they give you a chance to get lucky. which is some bee wanders over the hillside and goes, fuck me, I never knew all these flowers were there. And then it can go back and tell the other bees about them. And so there's a double payoff, okay? There's the chance to get lucky and there's the avoidance of very bad luck, which are both factors of variation when you put them into the mix. The reason they're not understood by accountants is because accountants are very nomothetic. Now, to understand this, read the book, which is called Seeing Like a State by a guy called, I think, Charles C. Scott. And he's kind of an anarchist Marxist who then writes a book which Tories love, because he's essentially saying that top-down central control demands and then imposes a very narrow set of metrics on the problem. It aggregates them and then comes up with solutions which may be entirely irrelevant to the local situation as experienced by the people on whom they're imposed.
It allows people to game the system. One of my favourite stories, I'm sure it's apocryphal, and like all good stories, the apocryphal ones are the best, is the 5-year plan in the Soviet Union for bicycle production. And that somebody came up with a centralised number. I don't know, I would guess it's 1 million bicycles a year. Needless to say, bicycle factory number 7 in Moscow just couldn't hit the target every year. And a very wily middle manager says, well, what we should do is not count the bicycles, but the measuring unit should be weight. How many tons of bicycles does the factory produce in a year? Well, it doesn't take a genius to see what happened. The bicycles got heavier and heavier every year. In fact, they produced far fewer until they were almost unrideable. And so all these sort of accountancy things paradoxically allow people to try and game the system. I mean, what do you do if you want to commit a fraud? You cook the books. In fact, that's pretty much, there are 2 elements to fraud, if anybody wants to get involved. You basically get good at cooking the books, and you borrow loads of other people's money, ideally without them realizing that they've actually lent it to you. And then you're off. You're away then. One last thing, whilst we're having a go at accountants, which is always good, I should declare an interest here. My father was a very stern accountant, and so this is my opportunity to make some sharp remarks in return, maybe.
So I'll disclose a personal interest. I am one, but I'll tell you what's brilliant is you get cheaper car insurance if you're an accountant. So long may that continue, and it's one of the reasons for continuing my membership. But feel free to be critical of my profession.
Well, I'm going to self-identify as an accountant now when I apply for insurance. One of the interesting things that accountancy has done, and I think is again a big problem, is because, and it's linked to modern technology and data collection, is we produce accounts far too often. The original double entry accounting system in medieval times was only done in a partnership when one of the partners left or joined or died or whatever. There was no concept of annual accounts until well into the 19th century. We then got into this insane business in the stock market of quarterly accounts. When I think about that, there's a 12-week window where we get these very sonorous sort of announcements from chief executives of what's going to happen over the next 12 weeks. And I think this is not added to the sum total of knowledge of how businesses are run. It's just simply that there's the ability to produce all this stuff. And of course, the apogee of all of this is this wretched idea of value at risk in finance, where you could somehow produce an algorithm that on initially a daily idea, the JP Morgan 415 report, as it used to be called some 20 years ago, to now instantaneous revaluation of everything. And I would just invoke Warren Buffett as my first witness on this, is that his view is be very careful of accounts, because there are only 2 elements to accounts. There's cash and there's an opinion. Everything else is an opinion. And you just got to find the right accountant to get the right opinion to get your fraud going, basically.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting you mentioned that, because I was interviewed once on Bloomberg TV for reasons I don't fully understand. And the Bloomberg person spoke very approvingly of a large Fortune 500 person, Fortune 500 CEO, who had a daily view of the live P&L on the company. And my response to that was, that's not a business, that's a Tamagotchi. You know, that's Farmville, okay? That's just totally stupid. The noise to signal ratio in that information is going to be abominable. You know, it's atrocious.
Not only that, it is an Olympic level comfort blanket.
Well, okay, here's an interesting one, which is I think we thought that when the Soviet Union collapsed, we'd eradicated this problem of central control. Okay, I think the IT industry has caused it to re-emerge in Western capitalism by creating the delusion among people at the top that if only you have enough information, everything can be centralized. And so the nomothetic elite, who also steal far too much of the money, because who decides what people are paid? Administrators, right? Who do they think are particularly valuable? Administrators. When I started in advertising, the people who wrote the ads were paid more than the people who fiddled with the fucking money. Okay, if you went to a hospital, the highest paid doctor was paid more than the highest paid administrator because they were creating more value. Now the people who shuffle money and value around and redefine it and quantify it are better paid than the people who actually do the job. Okay, and so this administrative self-delusion, which is bolstered by the IT industry selling them the delusional belief that if only you have enough data, everything can be done centrally. And indeed, you can get rid of the intermediate employees altogether and turn it into one great administrative kind of fantasy. Okay. This is actually re-emerging in large companies in the Western Hemisphere. And one of the reasons, by the way, very interesting, because temperamentally I'm an anarchist. And so I'm fundamentally in favor of the ideographic, not the nomothetic, to use this language of anthropology. Okay. And I couldn't work for the BBC because Rod Liddell goes up to the BBC to be interviewed by the BBC in Manchester, and he meets some mates at Euston Station, and they said, "Oh, brilliant! You're on the 4:20 train to Manchester. We'll see you on the train and have a few bevies." And Rod goes, "I don't think I can because the BBC insists I travel second class." Okay, Rod Liddell looks at his ticket and gets his ticket out and goes, "Yep, it's a £240 full fare second class return." And all his mates go, "We're in first class. Look, we got a 70 quid advance ticket." Okay. So you get that's a classically nomothetic rule where it essentially demands utter idiocy of the people at the coalface. Okay.
I'm tempted to open another avenue here. There's a guy called Peter Turchin, who I think is an anthropologist, who's done a lot of research.
He's a Cliodynamicist. He's the world's first Cliodynamicist.
Yes, and he's done a lot of interesting work on looking at why empires build up and why they collapse. And one of his current theories, which is, it's been around for about 20 years and it seems to be unfolding, is that we are actually producing, and this may be a controversial point, we are overproducing, or dare one say overeducating, too many in the administrative class. We have a bloated officer class in business. Everybody's got these sort of Swiss Admiral titles. The longer the title, the less important the person is, of course, the iron rule. Gone is the tea lady. It's now global head of beverage distribution. And I think there are a hell of a lot of people who have got non-jobs because they expect to have some sort of executive job because they've been to a university. And I know this is a little bit controversial and some people would violently disagree with this, but there are a hell of a lot of people, and this may include me, who aren't doing anything very much. I mean, there are in loads of organisations, there are a hell of a lot of people who have jobs I don't even understand the job title, let alone give an idea of what they may be doing.
But this plays into a beautiful, if either of you read David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs book, which is a phenomenal expose of it's coming from a different angle, but it's precisely that point, that we've created all these nonsense roles just to perpetuate things as opposed to for good fundamental reasons.
I mean, I don't know what the solution to this is because it seems hard.
Well, actually, before Peter Turchin, I think Ibn Khaldoun said something very similar. And I can't remember Ibn Khaldoun's dates now, but it's medieval because he's an early Islamic scholar. And it's elite overproduction is the phrase. Here we are. Let me get Ibn Khaldoun. Unsurprisingly, the Middle Eastern people were ahead of the game here. Here we go. May 1332 to the 17th of March 1406. And he spotted exactly the same problem in the collapse of empires, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a book which I haven't read, but it won't stop me from talking about it, of course. It was recommended to me the other day. I think it's called The Great Wave. And this, I'm just doing the same thing here, looking up who the author might be. And this looks at the idea that basically things do go in very long-term cycles, and though we think we're in control of these things, as we know, empires come and go, and they have a certain cyclicality to them that is, inevitable. It depends on your politics, but you might think, how much longer can Western economies keep spending more money and only doing so by getting into greater and greater debt? At some point, does the music stop on all of this? I think it's by a guy called David Hack, so maybe that's one for us to read at some stage in the future. And it's called The Great Wave, Price Revolutions and the Rhythm of History. And it's sometimes forgotten that one of the reasons that the French Revolution happened was the absolute destruction of the currency in the preceding 20 or 30 years through titanic overspending by various French monarchs. And eventually things came to an end. That may be a little way away from, do we have too many administrators in lots of areas of life?
No. It's related, because the measures at the top are not representative of what's happening in reality. So we could also get onto ergodicity, couldn't we? Which is related to this thing, which is that the life is lived non-ergodically, one lifetime at a time. But what you might call the nomothetic 1% essentially judge economic success by a series of snapshot aggregates.
Yeah, I mean, I think you, in a conversation once, gave a very good, simple example of ergodicity, which is at a career level, where if you're chairman or CEO of a massive corporation, you say to all the heads of the department, I want you to really go gangbusters for it, take every possible risk, and let's really push forward. That makes a lot of sense to him as CEO, because all the global heads are just part of his portfolio. But if you're the global head, it's insanity, because you are essentially taking a bet to nothing that you won't even get the benefit for if it goes right. And so it's an asymmetric relationship between CEOs and departmental heads. And I think a lot of this is not understood
No. So it needs to be understood in understanding the nature of the firm, actually, because it's a better explanation of the nature of firms than Coase's explanation, which won him a Nobel Prize, which is you need a firm so that you can redistribute aggregate gains to insure people against individual losses. So Daniel Kahneman had this. He never said who it is, and I've always suspected it might be GE. But he goes around the table, I think. They have the heads of all those GE divisions, like the head of enormous metal things and so forth. And he asks each of them individually, he says, would you take a bet which had a 50% chance, let's say, of your profits going up by 40% next year, and had a 50% chance of your profits falling by 20% next year? And all but one of them said no, because that's a 50% chance of me losing my job. And the chief executive sitting at the end of the table goes, but hold on, I'd want all of you to take those bets. So the interest, unless you can actually align interests very cleverly, so that there's a kind of trade-off between what you might call the time average growth rate and the aggregate growth rate, then essentially the point of firms is that it allows for some degree of risk-taking and failure in individual level, so that you can actually aggregate the gains.
That's really important, because the importance of being allowed to fail, I think, is a key part of innovation. And if you think of one of the great early adoptions of properly forming innovation within a firm, it is the Skunkworks of Lockheed Martin during the war. And the key thing they did was they said, right, we want to pull out 10% of the brains of the company to go off in a separate department and have big thoughts and come up with new products. Nobody wanted to go because they were terrified that if they were moved over and all they did was create a square wheel, people would say, well, those guys are a bunch of idiots. They spent a lot of time and money, and look, they've come up with a square wheel. So what Lockheed Martin said was that if you go on this team, and even if you create a square wheel, you will get a promotion. And so that they will, in a sense, they put a safety net under people, saying, look, you don't have to take a disproportionate risk to free you up to see if you can think of new ideas.
So a guy who really understood this was a client of David Ogilvy's, I think at Mattel. And there was a guy there who made some major cock-up and ordered like 1,000 times more dolls than was actually required. Or something. I'm not even sure what it was, but some really massive cock-up. And David Ogilvy said to this chief executive, he said, are you going to fire him? And he said, hell no. He said, I fire people who don't make mistakes.
Brilliant.
Yeah. In other words, which I think is actually really, really clever, because he was understanding in some ways the nature of that. The other example I always give is that as a penalty taker in 5 penalties to decide, let's say, a World Cup semi-final, it actually makes sense to whack, for some of you, not all of you, obviously, for some of the people to wang the ball straight down the middle, because the goalkeeper is overly predisposed to jump left or right. The problem with people doing it is that if they fail, they look like total idiots.
Yeah.
If you kick the ball left and the goalkeeper saves it, you look unlucky. If you kick the ball straight down the middle, you're more likely to score. But in the event that the goalkeeper saves it, you look like a useless footballer. So the only way to solve that problem is for the manager to go out in advance and say, player 2 and player 4, I want you to wang the ball straight down the middle. If it fails, you can tell everybody that I told you to do this.
Yeah. I mean, this is analogous to why fund managers follow indices. If you outperform the index by taking a risk, brilliant. But nobody gives you any credit for it. If you underperform the index, you get your ass absolutely kicked. Because, look, even an idiot could have got the index level by just buying the index. And this is like a massive problem, I think, in financial management.
This sort of reminds me of the whole defensive decision-making, which is, we investigate failures. We don't investigate successes. So what are we incentivized to do to protect ourselves against? It's almost like I don't want to run audit risk, so I'll just do the safe thing. And we don't do that because I think we're not looking at, if you succeed, it's brilliant. It's that classic piece. I'll judge everything based on its outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I went to an early shindig organised by Rory of Nudgestock. It was the second one, Rory, in Deal. And you had there, I think, one of the most fascinating talks I've ever heard. And I make people go and listen to it on YouTube. And it was called The Fatal Bias by Jules Goddard.
Yeah.
And Jules Goddard, in 9 minutes, nailed the tyranny of efficiency. And he also pointed out that there was one line for income and there were 500 lines for costs. And that's sort of the same point as you've just been making, I think, Christian, I believe.
Right. Yeah.
And by the way, I mean, as a marketer, I'm going to say that the nomothetic elite love to discount marketing because marketing, unlike efficiency, doesn't submit to simple mathematical processes, okay? And so it lies outside their comfort zone. And so as a result, they've created a discipline called economics, which assumes that value is created in the factory, not in the mind of the customer.
Mm.
Because once you accept that value is created in the mind of the buyer, okay, actually it's co-created between, if you believe in service dominant logic, it's co-created between the company and its customers to some extent, okay? But if you accept the fact that actually value is subjective and isn't a product of manufacturing processes, then you suddenly lose your comforting tube map of the world, okay? Where all we have to do is reduce the price or increase the objective performance of something, and we will automatically succeed. And this leads generally, The other problem with, by the way, the other problem which is interesting, you know that great story about the Air Force, which was about to armour the planes where the bullet holes were, and a brilliant Colombian mathematician went and said, no, the planes you need to be looking at aren't the ones that made it back to the base. It's the planes that are at the bottom of the North Sea. You need to put the extra armour where the bullet holes aren't. Okay.
Yeah, that's Abraham Wald.
That's the guy. Absolutely right. Fantastic. Now, the interesting thing is that if a company goes bust by not doing enough marketing, nobody notices because they've never heard of it. Okay. So we suffer an automatic problem in that non-marketing failures are totally invisible.
Well, you could apply that to this whole thing of command and control and the sort of Sovietization of administration. I don't recall in the Soviet Union there being a big marketing department because you just had that overly heavy bike from Bicycle Factory number 5 because the rules have been set that that's what you need and that's what you will get. So no marketing, no innovation, no development, nothing.
This is why, I mean, when Thomas Watson had this belief that you need employees who are what he called wild geese. And the very interesting thing about the wild geese is that actually, in a way, highly obedient people, conformist people, lower down a bureaucratic organization, start to game the system. The disobedient people are the people who deploy what, again, Charles Scott calls the anarchist squint. He says, what you often see is people who have no knowledge of academic anarchism effectively behaving like anarchists to escape from the worst absurdities of imposed stupid metrics, essentially. And so the disobedient people at the bottom of the organization are often causing disproportionate value because the obedient people are actually destroying value by gaming the system. And the disobedient people are the people like me who go, I'm not traveling. So WPP has some second-class rail policy, okay? And I said, look, I've worked here for 32 years, right? I'm the vice chairman of the company. If I have to travel up to York with a graduate trainee and I'm sitting in second class, he's going to think, well, there's a load of point fucking sticking around here then, isn't there, right? Okay. I said, there is no way I'm happy to travel in second class because it's a total disaster. What I will do is I will buy a first-class advance ticket, which is cheaper than your ticket, and I will manage to travel up there in first class by the simple expedient of catching a fucking train, okay, which shouldn't be beyond my capacity. So the point is that the anarchist is actually generally creating more value, actually, than the obedient.
Here's another mental picture for people, which is sort of talking about gaming a system. And I think what you've just said, Rory, is very true and very valid. Sometimes people use analogies in risk, talking about a monkey and a dartboard. You know, the idea you have a chimpanzee is throwing darts at the dartboard and seeing what answer comes up. Or if you're doing the picture with economists, the chimpanzee hits the wall, he can't even hit the dartboard. What a lot of people do is they make the mistake that what you have to do is train the monkey. So we spend a lot of time on getting this monkey to be able to do double top. I mean, we're talking decades, I would think, for that to work. Whereas, in fact, the smart thing to do is to control what is on the dartboard. So if you make the dartboard only have 2 numbers and 90% of it is a 20, the chances are much higher that the monkey is going to hit that result. And this is what's going on in gaming the system. You know, you can't allow salespeople to set their own targets. It's why central planning, Gosplan in the Soviet Union and all these sort of things ultimately fail. But the downside to all of this is it takes a very long time for them to fail. I mean, how many more decades of administrators are we going to need in the NHS to realise it's not the best way to run a medical system?
No.
The trouble is so politicised, of course, just even questioning it at the moment is, you're the Antichrist if you make any sort of comment about the NHS. But the fact is that there are a lot of people in the middle who are gaming the system and doing rather nicely. Thank you very much.
Well, the whole system, of course, of ring back at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning for a doctor's appointment is gaming. Because they were measured on how many people got an appointment the day they asked. What the metric failed to spot is that there are a certain number of people who could be defined as people with jobs who actually need an appointment 2 days in advance so they can make sure it's a 9 a.m. appointment, not a noon appointment, and they can clear it with their work, okay? But because they set this very narrow thing, the GPs simply game the system by saying you can't book an appointment except on the day itself. So they hit 100% of their target. Meanwhile, people with jobs, particularly men with jobs who are doubly reluctant to go to the doctor, by the way, there's a huge unevenness there, are being underserved as a result of people gaming that system.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, and you see this in most top-down organisations, I think, it's there for the benefit of the suppliers, not necessarily for the best and benefit of the customer.
Incidentally, someone booking a doctor's appointment 3 days in advance, provided you ring them the day before and say, do you still need it, is doing you a favour, because they're saying, this will probably go away, but if I'm still shit on Friday, I want to see the doctor, okay? Now, that's a lot better than going into the doctor at the first sign of flu, right?
Yes.
So there's a whole load of suboptimality to that whole process, which is just mindlessly stupid.
I think, listening to ourselves talking here, Rory, I think we're in violent agreement on everything, except you're an early adopter and I'm the last adopter.
No, you're undoubtedly wiser than I am. I realise that I'm paying a huge price for my experimentalism.
Yeah,
you are. You're basically saying, there used to be a phrase about this, which the Americans used, the fact that you'd wait for British people to invent something like the video cassette recorder, you'd let them do all the development, and then just as it was reaching the point of marketability, you'd basically nick it. And the phrase was, let the Brits be first with the worst.
Well, I don't know why we're laughing, but yeah, exactly.
Fuck them. Well, I'm particularly grudging about that because when I was about 21, I inherited £100 from a great aunt, okay, whose husband's father had invented the Caterpillar track. A guy called Roberts. I think he was called, what was his name? My uncle was called Cyril. He'd invented the Caterpillar track on the eve of the First World War and sold the idea for, a few £1,000s to a Californian tractor company, which was called something like the California Tractor Company. And I always thought, well, okay, no big deal. What the hell? Never mind. I then discovered that the Californian Tractor Company he sold it to is now called Caterpillar.
This must be the second worst decision after the British government gave Rolls Royce jet engines to the Russians in the late 1940s. And with quite a stern note attached that they weren't to back engineer them or to try and copy any of the ideas. I mean, quite extraordinary.
There's a worse one, actually, which is the Americans, when they took over the production of penicillin, against British instructions, supplied small quantities of penicillin to neutral countries, including Spain and Argentina. Now, calling Spain and Argentina neutral, given that they both were fascist dictatorships, was probably a bit dubious. Some of that penicillin made its way to Hitler's doctor, which saved his life after the Stauffenberg bomb plot. So there we go. That was a pretty bad decision. I think we can kind of agree. Okay.
Wow. I think at this note, Christian, are you going to try and rein us in here? Because I think we've got about another 8 hours to go.
No. This is absolutely fabulous stuff. So look, we're almost out of time, and it's exactly what I'd hoped for on bringing you two together, because it's just unleash you and see where we come out. And so I'm sort of struck by as we end a interesting year, let's say, because we've learned a lot and things have shifted as you pointed out. What are your both of your thoughts for sort of looking forward to 2020?
I'm going to have before that I'm going to have a dig at Gerald. You see, which is that the advertising industry is consistent in a way that the finance industry isn't, because advertising people spend all their time saying, "Hey, why don't you buy more shit?" Now, in fairness, when you give advertising people money, they go, well, hey, let's wrap a Porsche around a tree, right? Wow, let's buy one of those. Okay. The finance industry, by contrast, does not have skin in the game, because you advise all your clients to buy highly leveraged something or other put options on so-and-so. But as soon as you get your annual bonus, you put it straight into the Halifax. So I'm going to say that
the iron law in finance is, don't put your own skin in the game. Find a client.
Exactly. Yes. we are consistent in that we are monster consumerists in our spare time. Okay.
In terms of my thoughts for 2021, nothing original. This virus, as everybody now sees, is an accelerator of a number of trends, whether it's a high street or Rory's pet topic of Zoom meetings and dressing up on Fridays for Zoom or dressing down. More of the same to come. People like sort of images, and the image that's doing the rounds now is talking about the K economy. Think of the letter K, where you've got the upswing in the K, where we're going to see huge benefits for the right parts of the business sector and maybe life in general. And the bottom swoop down of the K are people who may actually totally disappear. I mean, we've seen carnage in the high street this week, but it's not just in that. I wonder if the airlines are ever going to quite be the same again. I haven't been on a plane in over a year. I haven't been over the channel in 18 months. I just haven't really travelled. And I just wonder if the world, in a funny sort of way, is going to get is going to get bigger, not smaller. You know, we'll become like Alan Wicker, where it now is really exciting to go to Hong Kong, rather than 5 years ago say, "Oh bloody hell, I've got to go to Hong Kong again." Maybe the world will get bigger and things will seem more out of our reach than they did, I think.
So a very interesting thing, I think, would be if you talk to people who understand networks complexity, and that includes biologists, evolutionary thinkers, it includes very good statistical thinkers, nonlinear statistical thinkers. It includes anthropologists. It includes, a wide range of disciplines. Generally, not always, you'll find that they are less polarized in their opinions because we understand the imperfections of mental maps. Okay. So, for example, you will find, I think, among network thinkers, they don't get angry about Brexit because they can see there are trade-offs in both directions. Now, you will find among academics, my guess would be that, high energy physicists would probably be more sympathetic to Brexit than people studying some political science wank or whatever. Okay. The other thing is you don't get angry with left-wing opinions because you understand that there are trade-offs between the two things. So it makes you actually, as Gerald is, interestingly, it gives you an interesting equanimity on things which are Marmite questions for everybody else. So I would argue that there are gains to losses to Brexit, and that the great mistake of the European Union was it centralised things which it shouldn't have centralised. Foreign policy and defence kind of makes sense, okay, at that level. You'd argue that a currency simply doesn't, okay? You could also argue that, for example, free movement of people, for instance, it's obviously, to anybody who thinks about it, it's a total nonsense to have free movement of people before you have a common immigration policy. Because what you have now is Cyprus basically selling European passports to any dodgy Russian who comes along with €500,000, right? That's no. You can't have California deciding who crosses the border, and then as soon as they're across the California border, they've got a right to go and move to New York or Minnesota. Doesn't make sense, right? So it's obvious, an obvious illogicality like that got glossed over by people who have a kind of a tube map view of the world.
Well, we've managed to cover everything except the Rolling Stones, and I can't think of an easy way to shoehorn them in.
I can. There's a very good thing, which was there are some right answers, which is someone I met who grew up in the 1960s said there were only two questions in the 1960s: Beatles or Stones, and Indian or Chinese. And the correct answer is Stones and Indian. Okay, obviously. Okay. Now, interestingly, the other thing complexity people might say is you're probably more pro-India and less pro-China, because you'd see Chinese growth as being more directed and more centralized and hence more fragile than Indian growth, which is not much slower but is more organic in nature. Okay?
I'm just conjuring up a picture that I remember going to a karaoke bar in Hong Kong with a Chinese group who were posing as the Beatles. And you've now just explained to me completely why I thought it was a dreadful evening.
On that note, I'm going to call time on this and say thank you both so much, Rory and Gerald. It's been a supreme pleasure. I knew you'd be great together. This feels like a sort of super band collaboration. Thank you so much, both of you, for appearing.
The Travelling Wilburys of complexity science. There you go.
Thanks a lot, Christian. Thanks.
All the best.
So that's it for the 100th episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My huge thanks to Gerald and Rory for appearing on this episode and the one before and taking the show into triple digits. If you enjoyed this discussion with Rory and Gerald and haven't listened to the previous episodes in which they appeared individually, then do check those out. For more on the subjects they covered, do take a look at the extended show notes. My equally huge thanks to you for listening to the show. If you're new to it, then you can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show, please do leave a 5-star rating on your platform of choice. It really, really does help. If you're interested in learning more about human risk and the work I do with my clients, do visit the all-new human-risk.com website. It's also the place to go for links to the Human Risk newsletter and video channel. If you're on social media, then you'll find me on Twitter at Human Risk Blog, and do connect on LinkedIn. Just search for Human Risk and you'll find me. I absolutely love hearing from listeners, so do send me feedback and any ideas you have for other guests. Please stay safe. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you very soon for the, I can't believe I'm saying this, 101st episode of the Human Risk Podcast.